We all know that Judas Iscariot is the most famous traitor in history, the man who sold his friend for a meager 30 pieces of silver. But imagine carrying that shame for eternity, being the name synonymous with betrayal, worse than the most despicable villain in any story. Tonight, we drift into the real agony of his choices. In today's video, we'll talk about why it truly sucked to be Judas Iscariot, a man who was an outsider from the very start. So let's not waste any time and let's begin. Tonight, we peel back the layers of the man, starting not with the ultimate betrayal, but with the subtle, insidious burden that followed him from the very beginning. His name, Judas Iscariot. You're told that the name means betrayer or liar, but that's the retroactive judgment of history. The reality is much more mundane, yet far more painful. That second name, Iscariot, most likely meant simply man of Kerioth, and this simple geographical tag was the first, unshakable source of your isolation. Kerioth was a village deep in the heart of Judea, your homeland, which placed you firmly in the south, culturally and spiritually distinct from the vast majority of the men you called brothers. Think of the company you kept. Peter, Andrew, James, and John were Galileans, rough-hewn fishermen from the provincial north. The rest of the inner circle, Levi the tax collector, Thomas, Philip, were all tied to the same region, sharing a common accent, common customs, and a common political outlook. But you, Judas, were the sole Judean, the perpetual outsider in the inner circle, carrying the weight of the South's perceived sophistication and political fervor. This inherent difference, this simple fact of geography, meant you were always translating, always explaining, and always viewed through a slightly separate lens. It was a loneliness that persisted even when surrounded by friends, the subtle suck of never quite relaxing, knowing your jokes might land differently, and your historical references required a brief explanation. Your Galilean companions spoke with a thick country dialect that marked them immediately as northern provincials, while your Judean speech was purer, perhaps more educated, carrying the scent of Jerusalem and the temple. While they discussed the catch of the day or the simple parables of the Master, you were likely thinking about taxation, Roman administration, and the pressing political liberation that all good Judean nationalists dreamed of. This intellectual disparity was your private internal hell, making you the perpetual intellectual foil to 12 simple men. While they found profound truth in the simplest metaphors, a seed falling on good ground, a woman losing a coin, you were likely looking for the blueprint, the strategy, the political application of these teachings. The other men were content to follow the light, but you, Judas, constantly wrestled with the practical logistics of keeping that light powered and aimed correctly at the Roman occupation. You were the one they trusted with the bag, perhaps because your Judean background implied a certain proficiency in commerce and administration that the fishermen naturally lacked. But the burden of the bag, which we will explore later, was merely an extension of the geographical curse that marked you from the beginning. You were the anomaly, the only man from the center of power, Judea, following a man whose ministry was rooted in the despised, periphery, Galilee. The psychological strain of maintaining this facade of brotherhood while carrying such a deep-seated cultural and political misalignment must have been immense. Every time the Master spoke of a spiritual kingdom, every time he avoided confrontation with the Roman authorities, your Judean-bred expectation of a powerful, earthly Messiah clashed with the Galilean simplicity of the current reality. It was an internal, grinding conflict that made every day a little bit harder than it was for Peter, who simply needed to drop his net and believe. You had to drop your heritage, your political conviction, and your intellectual skepticism. And that was a cross you were forced to bear long before the events of Gethsemane. This subtle, ever-present isolation was the perfect incubator for the disillusionment that would soon bloom into a terrible act. This deep fissure, this fundamental difference in what you expected from the Messiah, is precisely what set the stage for your unwanted call to follow him, bringing your pragmatic zealotry into direct, inevitable conflict with radical peace. The dissonance that marked you as a Judean outsider was only amplified the moment you received the call. It wasn't the heroic recruitment scene you might imagine, not the dramatic dropping of nets, but a subtle, almost administrative inclusion that sealed your fate. The core of your internal conflict, the first reason it truly sucked to be Judas, was the clash between the Messiah you deeply desired, a political powerhouse, a zealot king who would wield the sword of liberation, and the gentle, bewildering man you were asked to follow. You, a man of Kerioth, carried the political fervor of Judea. You knew the history, the humiliation of Roman oversight, and the weight of messianic prophecy that promised a literal throne for the Son of David. When Jesus spoke, you didn't just hear parables. You heard coded calls to action, logistics, and strategy. When he spoke of the kingdom, your mind immediately jumped to the treasury, the army, the administrative reorganization that would follow the inevitable revolution. This was the expectation every Judean patriot carried, and it was the foundation upon which your entire discipleship was built. But the Master kept confounding that expectation. Instead of marching on Jerusalem, he lingered in Galilee, healing the sick and talking to Samaritans. Instead of raising an army, he spoke of turning the other cheek. This was the first cold betrayal you felt, the betrayal of prophecy, of hope, and of the political necessity that you felt so keenly. It was a daily, grinding frustration to watch a man who clearly possessed limitless power, the power to walk on water, to command the winds, to feed thousands with a few loaves, choose to waste that tactical advantage on teaching obscure spiritual truths. Imagine the private conversations you must have had with yourself, perhaps lying awake while the others snored, simple men whose faith was uncomplicated by political calculation. You would have reasoned, calculated, and justified. Surely, the Master was simply waiting for the right moment, gathering his spiritual forces before launching the true, glorious, earthly attack. Surely, this was all a divine deception, a tactical retreat into pacifism until the legions were ready to move. This internal monologue, the constant need to reinterpret radical peace as delayed zealotry, was an exhausting labor that your fellow disciples never had to endure. And yet, you stayed. The power was undeniable. You saw the miracles, felt the authority of his presence, and perhaps, for a time, even the most pragmatic part of you was caught by the spiritual tide. You were an intellectual wrestling with the miraculous, constantly attempting to fit the square peg of divinity into the round hole of political strategy. This forced adherence to a mission you fundamentally misunderstood became the grinding friction of your early discipleship. While the others were filled with simple wonder, you were filled with profound, complicated, and increasingly resentful disappointment. The psychological toll of this dissonance was immense. You couldn't just drop your political expectations like Simon Peter dropped his fishing net. Your entire identity as a Judean was wrapped up in the concept of a strong, conquering Messiah. You stayed because you couldn't afford not to. To walk away would be to admit the failure of your own political hopes, to admit that your zealotry had been misplaced. It was easier to stay and keep hoping that the master would eventually switch tactics, drop the parables, and pick up the revolutionary mantle. This tension, this constant search for the political blueprint in the spiritual sermon, led perfectly to the role you reluctantly accepted, the treasurer. It was a way to ground the celestial mission in earthly reality, to give your pragmatic mind something concrete to manage. If the kingdom wasn't going to be established by force of arms, it would certainly require funds. And who better to manage those funds than the educated Judean, the only one who truly understood the cost of things, the logistics of feeding a large traveling ministry, and the necessity of keeping accounts? The master saw your intellect, your capacity for organization, and your deep, albeit misdirected, commitment to the cause. He entrusted you with the bag, not as a mark of disdain, but perhaps as a way to engage your talents. But for you, Judas, the bag became the physical anchor to the earthly concerns that the master seemed determined to transcend. It was the concrete proof that this mission, however spiritual its language, still depended on silver and bronze, on the kindness of strangers, and on the harsh realities of the marketplace. This administrative role, born out of your Judean practicality and the Galileans' lack of it, instantly became the focal point of your conflict, the seed of your eventual fall. The bag, initially a symbol of trust, quickly transformed into a daily reminder of the mission's embarrassing poverty and your own gnawing temptation, setting the stage for the true burden of the bag. The transfer of the money bag into your hands should have felt like a promotion, a sign of the master's special trust in your competence, especially as the sole Judean among the men. But in reality, carrying the bag was a soul-crushing logistical nightmare, a daily, tangible reminder of the ministry's humiliating poverty. This job, which none of the simple, unconcerned Galileans would have wanted, was immediately one of the central ways it truly sucked to be Judas. You were the treasurer of a movement that owned nothing, perpetually reliant on the kindness of local women and the occasional generous patron. Think about the daily stress. This wasn't a government treasury or a merchant's chest filled with gold. This was a fluctuating, pitiful collection of small coins, often consisting of widows' mites and the meager offerings of the poor. You had the thankless task of stretching a few denarii to feed 12 men and the master, plus the constant stream of followers for weeks on end. It meant haggling for bread in the market, calculating the minimal necessary expenses, and enduring the silent, anxious fear of running out of money miles from a friendly village. The anxiety of stewardship was a burden the others simply didn't carry. Their faith focused entirely on the master's ability to provide, while your faith was tethered to the very real, very empty weight of the leather bag. This role also forced you to constantly engage with the very system the master sought to transcend, the world of commerce, debt, and value. While the master taught that you cannot serve both God and mammon, you were the one who had to count mammon every night. Every coin you handled represented a choice between charity, necessary supplies, or perhaps investment in a future that still looked politically uncertain. The constant exposure to this small, portable wealth was the true source of temptation, and the suck here lies in the slow, corrosive effect of having access to money while possessing nothing yourself. It's the quiet shame of the discrepancy. You were entrusted with the group's funds, yet you were as poor as the men who followed you, and every day the master preached about giving everything away. This ideological conflict created a psychological breach. If the master was truly the king, why was the royal treasury so pathetic? Why weren't the rich flocking to fund this revolutionary kingdom? This disconnect chipped away at your belief, fueling the earlier political disappointment with economic doubt. The money bag, therefore, became a physical symbol of the ministry's political failure. Furthermore, being the treasurer meant you were always the target for requests, the one who had to say no. Imagine the constant needling from your colleagues for a little extra, a new pair of sandals, a better meal, a bit of relief from the road. You were the keeper of the purse, the gatekeeper of comfort, and every denial likely bred subtle resentment and suspicion among the others. They didn't see the true state of the funds. They only saw the man who held them. This position of enforced authority over meager resources only deepened your isolation. The act of handling the money, the counting, the securing, the worry, was a necessary distraction from the spiritual depth of the master's teachings. While the others were immersed in the parabolic wisdom, you were mentally tallying the travel expenses to the next town. This forced practicality made you less receptive, less open to the radical, non-material messages of the master. The earthly weight of the money bag made the spiritual lightness of the kingdom feel abstract and irrelevant. And of course, the temptation. It wasn't the temptation to seize the funds and run. It was the slow, steady urge to correct what you saw as a systemic flaw, to save a little, to perhaps invest a little, to ensure some small security for the movement. And perhaps, as the gospel suggests, a slight, almost accidental temptation to borrow from the fund, to take a little something from the collective for your own personal needs. This small, unacknowledged leakage, driven by anxiety and political calculation, became the secret that separated you from the community. It created a private guilt that acted like a growing tumor in your soul, preparing the ground for the public whispers that would soon follow. This constant private handling of the money, coupled with your anxiety over the mission's future, created a vulnerability that was impossible to hide from the master, and eventually impossible to hide from the community, setting the stage for the whispers of suspicion to begin. The ultimate suck of being Judas, even before the betrayal, was the relentless burden of suspicion. Chapter 3 detailed the private, corrosive anxiety of handling the money. We must address the moment that private doubt leaked into the public sphere, creating an atmosphere where you were already presumed guilty. The gospel accounts do not mince words. They label you a thief. Whether this was a single, desperate lapse or a continuous, small-scale embezzlement driven by political need, the effect on your reputation was terminal. This unprovable suspicion became the heavy cloak you had to wear, isolating you further from the men you served with. Imagine the daily scrutiny you faced every time the collective ran short on funds, every time a large charitable donation was suddenly spent. The eyes of the other disciples, particularly the simple, honest fishermen, would subtly shift toward you. They weren't accountants. They were men of direct action and simple faith. They didn't understand budgets or the need for contingency funds. They only understood that the money was meant for the poor, and if it wasn't there, someone must have diverted it. This was the crushing, unprovable charge that the trusted Judean, the keeper of the purse, was using the Lord's resources for his own ends. The psychological warfare of this environment is what truly breaks you. You were forced to maintain a flawless public display of devotion and selfless ministry. You preached the gospel, healed the sick, and cast out demons just like the other 11. Yet, every act of piety was undercut by the silent knowledge of your own secret, or the knowledge that others believed the worst of you. You were the one man who had to constantly overperform to compensate for the whispers, a performance that only fueled the suspicion, as if your zeal was merely a cover for your thievery. The irony here is agonizing. You were likely the most politically motivated of the group, deeply committed to funding a revolutionary movement, but your methods were already leading to your moral undoing. If you were indeed taking money, it was perhaps not for personal luxury, but for political ends, saving it for the moment the master would seize power, or perhaps secretly channeling it to other resistance cells in Judea. But intentions don't matter when the result is labeled theft. The other disciples only saw a man who handled money and yet seemed to lack the pure, unadulterated faith that allowed them to live hand to mouth. This created an atmosphere of profound internal isolation. You couldn't defend yourself without violating your own secret or revealing the mission's embarrassing penury. You couldn't confess to your brethren without risking expulsion and the abandonment of your political dream. So you stayed silent, allowing the suspicion to grow, turning your colleagues' trust into thinly veiled wariness. You became a character in your own tragedy, constantly listening for the sound of whispering that you knew was about you. This constant anxiety of being judged over petty sums of money created a vast chasm between your soul and the Master's spiritual mission. While the Master was talking about the love of God, you were preoccupied with the security of the bag. While he spoke of eternal treasures, you were worried about the cost of tomorrow's lodging. This financial anxiety, coupled with the gnawing suspicion, made you fundamentally unable to fully receive the spiritual message. Your focus was earthly, grounded, and ultimately doomed. The mounting tension, the private guilt, and the public rumors all needed a breaking point, a dramatic incident that would force the issue to the surface and reveal the spiritual breach that had been growing within you. That moment came unexpectedly in the quiet, lavish setting of a home in Bethany, a setting that magnified every one of your financial and political grievances into a blinding flash of moral clarity, or perhaps moral collapse. The anointing with the precious, costly perfume would serve as the final, unbearable catalyst, transforming quiet suspicion into open, righteous indignation and leading you directly to your final, fatal decision. The stage is now perfectly set for the drama of Bethany, where the price of a small flask of oil would utterly shatter your faith and your future. The air was thick and sweet in Bethany, almost suffocating, and that was the moment it all collapsed. This chapter details the absolute, agonizing suck of the anointing at the house of Simon the leper, where the astronomical cost of a single flask of perfume became the final, unbridgeable chasm between your practical mind and the Master's spiritual purpose. This incident wasn't just about money. It was the ultimate public rejection of your political zealotry and your financial stewardship, serving as the definitive spiritual breach that made the decision to betray the Master feel, in your twisted logic, entirely necessary. Mary, the sister of Lazarus, took a pound of pure nard, an oil so rare and costly that its price was equivalent to 300 denarii, nearly a year's wages for a common laborer. She poured it wastefully, gloriously, all over the Master's feet, filling the house with a fragrance that symbolized wealth and devotion. For the Galileans, this was a beautiful, overwhelming act of worship. For you, the pragmatic Judean, the treasurer, the man haunted by the collective's poverty, it was an intolerable, obscene waste. Your reaction was immediate and vocal, framed perfectly as righteous indignation. Why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? This was a rational political complaint, steeped in the language of social justice and the very principles of charity that the ministry preached. You spoke of the poor, but the truth is, the money was yours. The money, the control, the potential to alleviate the suffering of hundreds. That was the political resource you saw being literally poured onto the floor, absorbed by the dust and the Master's skin. The real suck here is the internal motivation. While the other disciples may have grumbled in passing, the Gospel tells us your complaint was driven by the desire to misappropriate the funds yourself. Your political desire to build an earthly kingdom, fueled by your financial anxiety and the rumors of theft, suddenly found a magnificent, undeniable grievance. This money was enough to fund the ministry for an entire year, perhaps even enough to buy the arms or the influence needed for the final revolutionary push. The Master, by allowing this waste, seemed to be conclusively stating that the spiritual mission was completely separate from the practical concerns of the world and the needs of the poor, a stance that shattered your zealot-bred conviction. When the Master offered his rebuke, it was a precise, targeted blow to your carefully constructed reality. Let her alone. Against the day of my burying hath she kept this. And then the final damning phrase that cut you loose. For the poor always ye have with you, but me ye have not always. This statement obliterated your political framework. It was an unmistakable declaration that his mission was finite, non-political, and rapidly moving toward a non-violent, sacrificial end. He was talking about death and burial, not coronation. In that moment, the entire dissonance of your discipleship reached its peak. The Messiah you wanted, the King who saves, was rejecting the very funds necessary to become that king, embracing instead the humility of a corpse prepared for the grave. This was not a betrayal by you yet, but a profound, final betrayal of your hopes and political expectations. The master's acceptance of the perfume was the final spiritual breach, confirming that the path he was on led only to spiritual sacrifice, not earthly power. The logical, pragmatic man who saw this lavish waste and heard the final confirmation of political failure now had only one logical course of action: to cut his losses. The master was clearly a dead man walking, having deliberately provoked the authorities and now rejecting the financial means to escape. Your deep-seated commitment to the revolutionary cause required you to either join him in foolish, peaceful sacrifice or take action to force his hand and salvage the movement's potential. The decision to go to the chief priests immediately following this incident was not a sudden, greedy whim, but the cold, logical outcome of a practical mind realizing its project was doomed. The next chapter will explore this shift, the transition from being a disgruntled disciple to becoming a cold, pragmatic negotiator seeking to cut his losses. The door slammed shut, not on the house of Simon, but on your soul. After the scene in Bethany, after the master's gentle, firm defense of Mary's lavish, wasteful act, there was only a cold, empty psychological space. Your practical, calculating mind, the one that managed the meager funds and dreamed of a revolutionary kingdom, now performed its final, fatal assessment. The mission was irredeemably compromised. This was the moment the disciple ceased to exist, and the cold, logical calculator took over, determining the most efficient way to salvage something, anything, from the wreck. It truly sucked to be Judas in that hour, because your decision to approach the chief priests was not born of sudden, blind malice, but of a terrifying, cold-blooded pragmatism. It was the rational choice of a disappointed investor cutting his losses. You had sunk 3 years of your life, your political hope, and your social standing into a venture that was now openly rejecting its own foundational purpose. The master had confirmed it. No earthly crown, no army, only a premature death and an expensive burial. From your perspective, you hadn't betrayed a friend. You had exited a failing project. The journey from Bethany to the temple area, likely undertaken in the cover of early evening, was the walk of a man shedding his identity. You shed the idealism of the call, the camaraderie of the road, and the spiritual confusion that had plagued you for years. What was left was the Judean zealot, the man of Kerioth, dedicated only to the idea of a purified Jerusalem, free of Roman oversight. Your only remaining option was to force the master's hand. If he wouldn't raise the political sword willingly, perhaps the threat of the temple guard would force his divine power to manifest. You reasoned that if he truly was the Son of God, the Messiah, he could not be captured, but would use the moment of crisis to reveal his true, conquering self. This was your final, desperate test. You walked, rehearsing the pitch in your mind. You weren't going to beg. You were going to negotiate. You had the one piece of intelligence the Sanhedrin truly needed: access. The master was too popular to arrest in public, too careful to linger inside the heavily policed walls of Jerusalem. He was a shadow moving between the city and the quiet sanctity of the Mount of Olives. You knew the schedule. the movements, the private places of prayer. You possessed the key to a quiet, efficient arrest, thus avoiding the riot the priests feared. You held the tactical advantage, and you intended to use it to leverage two things: safe passage out of the doomed ministry and funding for the continued true revolutionary cause. When you finally stood before the chief priests and elders, those powerful, cynical men who smelled of expensive oil and ancient parchment, you were prepared to present a proposal. You offered not just a betrayal, but a logistical solution to their political problem. You were selling not the master's life, but the quiet moment of his capture. "What will you give me if I deliver him to you?" you asked, your voice probably steadier than your heart. It was a business transaction, a necessary closure to a 3-year investment gone sour. Their reaction, however, was immediately insulting. They didn't offer a great purse of gold, the reward for a king or a political rival. They offered a paltry sum, barely enough to buy a small plot of land outside the city, a sum that spoke volumes about their own low estimation of the master's true threat, and, more damningly, your value as a turncoat. They offered the price of a slave injured by an ox, the price of common property damage, the price of the most disposable of commodities. But the sheer relief of having a way out, of having this terrible decision ratified by the established religious power, overcame the insult. The silver was a symbol of closure, a formal dismissal from the mission, a down payment on your new life as an unattached zealot. You took the coins, allowing the weight of the metal to replace the spiritual weight of the discipleship you were casting off. You believed you had successfully managed your exit, securing your future and forcing the Messiah into a position where he had to finally choose between earthly king and spiritual servant. The choice, you were certain, would be the king. You left the temple with the metallic taste of the silver heavy in your mouth, a free man in your own mind, tasked only with finding the perfect opportunity. The betrayal was now a signed contract, the money counted and secured, and the internal tension momentarily eased by the finality of the decision. But the suck was about to return with crushing force. You had achieved distance from the master's mission, but now you were forced into proximity once again, tasked with playing the role of the devoted disciple while the contract in your pocket dictated his capture. This forced closeness, this performance of friendship, would become the psychological torture that led directly to the unspeakable shame of the negotiated price. The chief priest's response to your offer was the ultimate insult, the deepest cut to your Judean pride, and the final confirmation of your own devaluation. The price they settled upon was 30 pieces of silver. You took the money, driven by the urgency of the moment, the relief of having secured the deal, but the quiet, crushing shame of that specific amount settled over you like a shroud. The suck of this chapter is not the loss of wealth, but the devastating symbolic weight of the 30 coins. This was not a king's ransom. It was not the reward offered for delivering a powerful political rebel. 30 pieces of silver was the fixed, regulated price of a common slave under Mosaic law. Specifically, the price paid to an owner if his slave was accidentally killed by another man's ox. Think about that for a moment. The Messiah, the man you had invested 3 years of your life, your entire political future, and the very health of your soul into, was officially valued by the ruling class as nothing more than disposable property, a piece of damaged chattel. The priests, in their cold, calculating cynicism, offered this exact sum, not by accident, but by design. It was the absolute lowest price they could offer while still adhering to the ancient codes. It was a price that simultaneously demonstrated their disdain for the man they were arresting and, more importantly, their profound contempt for you, the informer. They viewed you as the lowest form of mercenary, a necessary evil, and they paid you in the most humiliating currency possible. You weren't a political operative. You were a slave trader, and the master was the commodity. Imagine the metallic coldness of those coins in your palm. They felt heavier than gold, heavier than any physical currency, because each piece was weighted down by prophecy and shame. You, the educated man of Kerioth, the one who knew the scriptures, would have immediately recognized the prophetic echo from the book of Zechariah, where the prophet is paid the same insulting sum for his work. The priests might have seen this as a tidy way to fulfill prophecy, but for you, it was a terrifying confirmation of your role as the designated villain, the necessary instrument of a divine drama you were now powerless to escape. You tried to frame the exchange as a political move, a forced checkmate against the master. But the price itself reframed the entire operation as a squalid property crime. The priests refused to dignify your betrayal with a political reward because they wanted no part of the messianic politics. They simply wanted the disruptive preacher removed quietly, and you, the disgruntled treasurer, were the cheapest means to that end. The silence that followed the transaction must have been deafening. You secured the coins, tucked them away, the physical contract binding you to the act, and stepped back out into the noise of the temple. But everything had changed. The shame was suffocating, not the guilt of a thief, but the shame of a failed prophet who had just sold the greatest hope of his life for the least dignified price imaginable. The smallness of the sum amplified the size of the transgression. How could you justify sacrificing your relationship with the Master, your place among the chosen, and your eternal soul for a few months' wages? It was an act of profound, agonizing stupidity. This financial and symbolic devaluation solidified your spiritual isolation. You were no longer just the suspected thief. You were the public betrayer, officially deemed a man worth 30 pieces of silver by the highest religious authorities. This knowledge was now your secret, heavy cross, compelling you to walk through the last days of the ministry with the knowledge of your completed contract hidden in your purse. You had the money, but you were now spiritually bankrupt. The contract was clear: access for silver. Now came the most excruciating part of the deal: finding the right time and place. The city was crowded with pilgrims for the Passover, and a public arrest was impossible. You needed privacy, darkness, and certainty. The shame of the silver now forced you into a prolonged, unbearable proximity with the Master, where you had to wait for the opportune moment, pretending that nothing had changed. The internal torture of this charade, this performance of friendship while holding the price of his life, becomes the subject of your next agonizing ordeal. The coins were hidden, the deal was done, and the contract was active. But the work of the informer was not yet complete. Now began the most excruciating part of your mission, the waiting. The suck here is the psychological torture of forced closeness. You had to return to the ministry, sit among the disciples, and eat, walk, and sleep at the master's side, knowing that the 30 pieces of silver lay hidden, a testament to your completed agreement. You had sold him, and now you were required to act the part of his devoted, loyal friend. Think of the performance you had to maintain. Every day was a carefully managed charade. You had to listen to his teachings as if your heart still believed, nod along with the simple wonder of the Galileans, and participate in the communal prayer and meal sharing. Every word of wisdom, every healing, every gentle act of mercy from the Master was a needle plunged into your conscience, a mocking reminder of the small price you had accepted for his life. The physical proximity, the shared blanket, the close quarters of the road must have felt like a cage. The tension was suffocating. You were constantly scanning the horizon, not for Roman patrols, but for the opportune moment to strike, the tactical window you had promised the priests. The Master was vigilant, always surrounded by people, or withdrawing to the private sanctuary of the Mount of Olives. You needed a moment of absolute isolation, a quiet corner far from the crowds of pilgrims, and you knew exactly where that quiet corner was. The waiting was defined by the fear that your composure would break, that one of the others would see the cold, calculating panic behind your eyes. You had to be the best disciple now, the most observant, the most helpful, lest your sudden withdrawal attract suspicion. You had to participate in the planning for the Passover, the most sacred communal meal of the year, knowing that before the wine was poured, you would have sealed the betrayal. This was the ultimate cognitive dissonance, planning the logistics of the last communal supper while simultaneously planning the logistics of the arrest that would follow it. The most unbearable part was the Master's silence. He looked at you. He spoke to you. He allowed you to continue managing the bag and sitting in his presence. There was no thunder, no fire, no public denunciation, just an aching, profound stillness that suggested he knew everything and was allowing you the terrible, agonizing space to complete your choice. This silence was more condemning than any curse. It forced you to question your entire premise. If he knew, why didn't he stop you? If he knew, was this betrayal not simply your action, but a necessary, terrible part of the larger, incomprehensible plan? This gnawing theological uncertainty amplified the psychological torture. The days stretched, each hour weighed down by the knowledge of the contract in your tunic. You watched the other disciples, envying their simple, uncompromised faith, their capacity for wonder, their sheer lack of political or financial anxiety. They were free. You were a slave to the silver. The Master was the only other person in the world who knew your secret, and his compassionate gaze was relentless. It wasn't accusatory, it was pitying, and pity was the deepest form of humiliation for a proud Judean like yourself. This waiting period, this forced performance of devotion, perfectly set the stage for the final act, the Last Supper. The disciples were finally gathered, the city was subdued, and the religious feast provided the perfect cover for the ultimate political sacrifice. You knew the Master would withdraw afterward, as he always did, to the Garden of Gethsemane, the quiet olive grove on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. That familiar, predictable sanctuary, which you had visited 100 times as a follower, was about to become the appointed place for the transaction. The final communal meal was approaching, marking the end of the waiting and the start of the inescapable chaos you had engineered. The upper room in Jerusalem was quiet, shielded from the noise of the Passover crowds outside, and this final, peaceful gathering was where your internal isolation reached its crushing climax. This chapter focuses on the Last Supper, the communal echo of the sacred feast, and how your presence transformed it from a celebration of liberation into a suffocating chamber of foreboding. The suck here is the unbearable irony of being physically closer to the Master than ever before, yet separated by the vast, uncrossable chasm of your completed contract. You entered the room, the hidden coins still heavy in your pocket, and took your customary place, dipping your hand into the communal bowl, sharing the unleavened bread. The ritual of the Passover, meant to celebrate freedom from slavery and the salvation of the Jewish people, was transformed for you into a rehearsal of your own spiritual enslavement. You participated in the prayers and the blessing of the wine, every sacred word ringing hollow against the backdrop of your intended betrayal. The moment the Master took the bread, broke it, and offered it with the words, "This is my body, which is given for you," the irony must have been unbearable. He was offering a symbolic sacrifice of himself for the redemption of the world. And you, the practical man, the disillusioned zealot, were already halfway through the process of physically delivering that sacrifice to the executioners. You saw the bread not as a symbol of grace, but as a final, desperate meal before the violence began. Then came the wine, the shared cup of blessing, signifying the new covenant. To share that cup with the other men whose loyalty was uncomplicated, was torturous. You drank, performing the gesture of communion, knowing that your lips were already sealed by the price of blood. The physical act of sharing the cup, meant to bind the community together, only served to magnify your utter alienation from the table and the mission. The silence that followed was broken by the Master's quiet, devastating pronouncement. He spoke not of a prophecy that would be fulfilled by a distant villain, but of the immediate, personal tragedy at the table. "Verily, I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me." The raw, crushing impact of that statement rippled through the room. The other disciples reacted with simple, shocked innocence, murmuring, "Lord, is it I?" They were genuinely concerned, unable to comprehend that one of their sacred band could harbor such malice. But your question, when it came, was the most pitiful performance of all. You had to ask, had to maintain the facade of ignorant loyalty, even though you knew the answer better than anyone. "Master, is it I?" The difference in your address, using didaskalos, master or teacher, while the others used Kyrie, Lord, was a final, subtle rejection of his divinity, a linguistic choice that clung to the political relationship you preferred. The Master's response was a quiet, private confirmation, likely a whisper only you could hear. "Thou hast said." The final, crushing intimacy was the dipping of the sop. The Master took a piece of bread, dipped it into the dish, and handed it directly to you. This was not a condemnation. but an act of profound, agonizing familiarity, an ancient gesture of friendship and honor. This moment of extreme, focused attention, the knowledge that the entire agonizing tragedy was known and allowed, was the final spiritual trauma. He wasn't rejecting you. He was confirming your role with a gesture of personalized pity. This singular, symbolic act was the signal. The Aesop was swallowed, the final bread was broken, and the last remnants of the shared meal were complete. The master then gave you the final, chilling instruction that freed you from the table and sealed his fate. That thou doest, do quickly. It was a command, a release, and a terrifying permission. You rose from the table, leaving the warmth and the light behind, carrying the knowledge that your last moment of feigned friendship was over. You walked out of the light of the communal Passover, carrying the darkness of your contract into the cold, chaotic labyrinth of the Jerusalem night. The atmosphere in the upper room had fractured. The disciples, those 12 simple, loyal men, were now consumed by quiet terror, looking at one another, searching for the crack in the stone. But the true, crushing weight of the scene, the absolute suck of this moment, was the silence between you and the Master. He had spoken the prophecy, the damning truth, but he had done so with a quietude that denied you the confrontation you perhaps secretly craved. You wanted thunder, fire, a righteous storm that would either justify your action as necessary or instantly strike you down as a villain. Instead, you received only a gentle, knowing gaze. The other men were asking their questions, their simple, panicked murmurings. Lord, is it I? They asked it of Christ, of the Lord, using the reverence of Curie. They were asking the question in genuine terror, unable to reconcile the idea of betrayal with their own pure hearts. But when your turn came, your question carried the final, cutting distinction that separated you from them forever. Master, is it I? You used didaskalos, the simple term for teacher. It was a subtle, final rejection of his divine claim, a linguistic refusal to acknowledge him as anything more than the political, earthly figure you had come to dismiss. You were clinging to the political relationship, even as you prepared to terminate it. Your question, pitched as a pitiful performance, was not a plea for information, but a desperate, final attempt at denial. You were testing the Master one last time. Will he deny it? Will he offer a public reprieve? Will he allow me to save face and walk away clean? You were offering him an elegant exit, a chance to say, no, not you, Judas. You are merely confused. But the Master refused the lie. His reply was private, direct, and devastating. Thou hast said. It was a quiet confirmation, a whisper that allowed the performance to continue for the sake of the others, but which utterly stripped you bare. He knew. He had always known. This was the raw, crushing moment of exposure, yet it was played out with the terrifying intimacy of a private conversation in a crowded room. The suck was the realization that your entire operation, the secret meetings, the hushed negotiations, the hidden silver, had been an open secret to the one person you sought to deceive. You hadn't tricked destiny. You had merely walked willingly into your pre-assigned role. You weren't the architect of the betrayal. You were the instrument, and the Master had patiently waited for the instrument to complete its task. And then came the final, symbolic act that made all words unnecessary. the dipping of the sop. It was an ancient, powerful gesture of honor in that culture, where the host would offer the choicest piece of bread, dipped in the savory sauce, to the guest he wished to honor most. The master took the bread, dipped it, and handed it directly to you. This was not a curse. It was an act of profound, agonizing familiarity, a final, unearned courtesy extended to the one who would destroy him. This gesture of honor, twisted into the seal of your fate, confirmed your role with a final, personalized pity that must have felt like a searing brand on your soul. You swallowed the sop, and with it, you swallowed the last vestiges of your spiritual freedom. The act was done. The master had sealed your choice with a morsel of bread. The gospel says that immediately Satan entered into you, but the truth is simpler and more agonizing. The weight of your own conscience, the full, crushing realization of what you had done, finally broke your practical, calculating mind. You were no longer acting on logic. You were propelled by a sudden, irresistible horror. The master, watching your internal collapse, offered the final, chilling instruction that freed you from the table. That thou doest, do quickly. It was a command that held no malice, only the necessity of speed. It was the release you needed, the permission to flee the suffocating warmth and light of the communion you had contaminated. You rose from the table, not in triumph, but in a panicked, desperate flight. The warmth of the room, the shared glances of the disciples, the master's relentless pity, all of it had become an unbearable weight. You needed the cold, indifferent darkness of the night to hide the shame that was now blazing from your soul. You walked out, carrying the darkness with you, propelled toward the contracted meeting, finally alone and committed to a path of no return. You burst from the upper room, leaving the shared warmth and the terrible, knowing silence of the Passover behind. It was night, deep and thick, and the sudden shift from the lamplit intimacy of the supper to the cold, chaotic darkness of Jerusalem must have been a physical shock. The suck of this chapter is the sheer, overwhelming isolation of that journey. You were truly alone, committed to a path from which there was no possible return. Your walk was the physical manifestation of your moral fall, traversing the sleeping city, guided only by the heavy weight of the silver in your pocket and the cold contract in your mind. Jerusalem was a labyrinth, especially at night during the Passover, filled with shadows, winding alleys, and the unexpected noise of a city hosting thousands of pilgrims. Every corner you turned, every unexpected sound, every glimmer of light spilling from a closed window was a psychological hazard. You were walking into a conspiracy, a deal with the highest powers in the city, and that knowledge made every rustle of the wind sound like a whisper of accusation. You were heading toward the temple area, toward the chief priests and the elders who were anxiously awaiting your signal. But the journey itself was a descent. You walked down the slope from the upper city, where the wealthier homes were, down through the crowded middle sections, toward the administrative and religious centers near the temple walls. As you descended, the political complexity of your act became terrifyingly clear. You were no longer just a disillusioned disciple. You were a cog in a vast, ancient machine designed to crush threats to authority. The darkness itself seemed to conspire against you. It offered cover for your secret, but it also magnified your internal panic. The streets that were familiar by day became a maze of shadows where fear could breed unchecked. You had willingly stepped outside the protective light of the Master and his mission, and now you were exposed to every lurking anxiety and spiritual terror. The absence of the Master's presence, the quiet authority that had guided and protected you for 3 years, was suddenly, acutely felt. You were vulnerable, a lone man on a desperate mission, and the city felt immense and hostile. Your thoughts must have been a chaotic swirl. There was the constant, metallic thud of the silver against your body, a physical reminder of the price you had paid for this isolation. There was the memory of the sop, the final intimacy, the devastating pity of the Master's final gaze. And there was the gnawing, intellectual terror that perhaps you had been wrong, that the Master truly was divine, and that this pragmatic, logical choice was in fact the greatest mistake a man could make in the history of the world. This journey was the final, irreversible commitment. You were crossing the line from disgruntled follower to active participant in a capital crime. Every step took you further away from the other disciples, who were likely still huddled in confusion in the upper room, wondering about your sudden departure. You were severing all social, spiritual, and communal ties, embracing a future where your name would forever be synonymous with the darkness you now walked through. You arrived at the agreed-upon location near the temple, perhaps a quiet courtyard or a lesser-known gate, and the sight awaiting you would have been a chilling confirmation of your new reality. No longer were you dealing with humble fishermen. You were dealing with the cynical, calculating power structure of Jerusalem. The next step was the physical assembly of the arresting party, a sight that would instantly confirm your status as a lowly tool, forcing you to move from your private internal fear to the public humiliation of leading the contingent to Gethsemane. The cold, hard logic that had driven you to the priests was about to confront the terrifying, chaotic reality of state power mobilized for arrest. You arrived at the predetermined rendezvous point, still reeling from the sudden flight and the suffocating isolation of the night. But the fear of isolation was swiftly replaced by a new, more cutting humiliation: the sight of the assembled entourage. This was the moment where your intellectual, pragmatic decision to leverage the chief priests backfired completely, as you realized you were not a partner in this political maneuvering, but merely a necessary, despised tool. The suck of this chapter is the cold, stark realization that you had sold yourself to men who held you in profound contempt. The assembled company was a chilling mix of official power and brute force. There were the chief priests themselves, or their delegated representatives, the temple elders, powerful robed figures who stood apart, their faces etched with cynicism and disdain. They were the men who signed the contract, the client. Alongside them stood a contingent of temple guards, the Jewish security forces, and critically, a detachment of Roman soldiers. Perhaps only a few, but enough to show the official backing of the occupying power. They were armed, silent, and entirely impersonal. The first insult was the sheer size of the contingent. They had clearly taken your mission seriously, believing the master was a genuine threat. But in mobilizing such a large, heavily armed group, they demonstrated their complete lack of trust in you. You had guaranteed a quiet, efficient handover, but they had prepared for a riot. Your competence was immediately questioned, and your value, already established at the price of a slave, sank lower still. The interaction must have been minimal and entirely transactional. You likely approached the lead priest, your voice low and hurried, trying to maintain the facade of a confident operative. But their gaze was not one of gratitude. It was one of cold, professional necessity. They didn't greet you as an intellectual equal or a fellow zealot. They treated you as an essential, but deeply tainted piece of equipment. You were the guide, the simple navigation device, nothing more. You were no longer the treasurer, the political visionary, or even a disgruntled disciple. You were just the one who knew the place. This reduction of your identity to a mere function, a finger pointing in the darkness, must have stung your Judean pride deeply. You had gone to them believing you were facilitating a final, desperate checkmate to force the master's hand. You left as the hired help leading a mob. The presence of the temple guards and the Roman detachment solidified this humiliation. The guards, your fellow Jews, regarded you with professional distaste. They were men doing their duty, and you were the turncoat making their job easier. The Romans, if they were present, regarded you with utter indifference, seeing you as just another petty native informant in a conquered land. You were universally despised by the men you had sought to impress or aid. Now, with the contract enforced and the entourage assembled, you had to physically turn and lead them. You had to step out of the shadows of the rendezvous point and assume the position at the head of the dark procession. This was the final, agonizing moment of public acknowledgement of your betrayal before the act was even complete. You were leading the forces of oppression to the spiritual sanctuary of your master. The journey began immediately. You became the point man in this chaotic, noisy march through the sleeping city. The suck was now external and immediate. The shame of leading the enemy, of hearing the clanking of their weapons and the scuffing of their boots, all following your direction. The quiet, desperate walk of isolation was over, replaced by a loud, profane procession that you, Judas Iscariot, had instigated. You were marching toward the Mount of Olives, and the weight of the silver in your pocket was nothing compared to the weight of the mob marching at your back. The path to Gethsemane was now a path of growing moral panic, leading directly to the ultimate necessity of the agreed-upon sign. The march to the Garden of Gethsemane was a terrifying, loud, and profoundly profane disruption of the sacred night. You, Judas, were forced to lead the procession, walking a few steps ahead of the heavy-footed temple guards and the Roman detachment, the only light coming from the flickering torches they carried. This was the final, agonizing phase before the arrest, and the suck was the unbearable dissonance between the violent chaos you led and the quiet sanctity of the place you were heading. Imagine the sound of it, the metallic clank of swords and spears, the harsh scrape of sandal leather on the stones, the low, cynical muttering of the priest's servants, and the rhythmic crackle of the oily torches. It was a cacophony of state violence cutting through the silence of the sleeping city, and you were its conductor. Every sound was a hammer blow against your already fractured conscience, a loud, public declaration of the act you had intended to keep quiet and politically rational. The path took you down through the Kidron Valley, across the narrow bridge or dry riverbed, and up the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives. This entire route was familiar, a well-worn track you had walked 100 times with the Master and the other disciples, often in quiet, contemplative peace. Now, you led a mob of armed men down that same path, destroying the sanctuary of memory with every step. As you walked, you were forced to endure the fear of the guards and the manifest disdain of the priests. The guards, tense and ready for a fight, likely spoke in harsh, clipped tones, urging you to move faster, reminding you of the necessity of silence. They were focused on the risk of riot, on the potential for the Messiah to command the divine power you secretly hoped he would finally unleash. Your own heart must have been a drum in your chest, beating a frantic rhythm of panic, a panic born of fear of the Master, fear of the mob behind you, and fear of the final, irreversible consequence of your own actions. The moral panic was now acute. The logic of disillusionment had dissolved completely under the weight of the temple's official power. You saw the reality of what you had done. You had not checkmated a political aspirant. You had delivered a peaceful man to the apparatus of state execution. The sight of the Garden of Gethsemane finally appearing in the wash of the torchlight, the ancient olive trees, the familiar stone wall, must have hit you with the force of a physical blow. You knew the layout. You knew which disciple was likely on watch, and you knew the Master's likely place of retreat. This intimate knowledge, once a source of trust and camaraderie, was now the very tool of his destruction. The Master and his companions were not hiding. They were praying, communing in their customary sanctuary. Your procession was the invasion of a sacred, private moment. You stopped the procession just outside the familiar confines of the garden, signaling the successful end of the guiding phase. The priests and commanders now looked to you for the final confirmation, the guaranteed method of identification in the darkness. You had led them to the place, but there were other men there, Peter, James, and John. They needed certainty, and you had provided the code for certainty in your contract. The chaotic march ended, but the most painful, most symbolic action was yet to come. The delivery of the agreed-upon sign that would definitively and intimately mark the Master for arrest. This final, necessary act was the code of the kiss. The march had ended. The sounds of the armed contingent hushed as they reached the perimeter of Gethsemane. Now, in the sudden stillness beneath the ancient olive trees, the final, agonizing detail of your contract came due, the sign. The priests, mistrustful and cynical, had demanded a foolproof method of identifying the Master in the darkness amid the confusion of the sleeping disciples. And you, in your cold, pragmatic planning, had offered the most horrific sign imaginable, the kiss. The absolute, crushing suck of this moment was the symbolic horror of having to use the most intimate gesture of friendship and respect as the ultimate act of betrayal. Why the kiss? It was a necessity born of the Master's lack of identifying marks. He wore no crown, carried no sword, and looked exactly like his simple Galilean followers, many of whom also wore beards and rough clothing. The guards needed certainty, a zero-tolerance confirmation that they were seizing the right man and not provoking a needless riot by mistaking Peter for the master. The kiss was the only certain, non-verbal sign that pointed to the man of authority, the one who would be greeted by his followers with that mark of familial respect. You stepped away from the tense armed mob, walking forward into the wash of torchlight filtering through the olive leaves. You knew exactly where he would be, praying, just as you had left him, communing in the profound stillness that you had just shattered with the clank of iron. The distance between you and the master, perhaps 20 paces, was the longest journey of your life. A physical walk that traversed the entire distance from the simple call by the sea to this ultimate dark finality. You approached him, finding him exactly where he should be, his head perhaps lifted, his face illuminated by the distant torch glow. He was watching you come, his eyes holding no surprise, no anger, only an infinite, sorrowful pity. This passive acceptance of his fate, this quiet acknowledgement of your role, was the sharpest rebuke you could ever receive. You had hoped your actions would force his hand, compel him to raise an army or call down fire. Instead, your act was merely confirming his path towards sacrificial surrender. You moved toward him swiftly, efficiently, the man of action completing the final, necessary task. You raised your hands, perhaps placed them on his shoulders, or moved to embrace him, and you delivered the kiss. It was a formal, chilling act, a gesture of respect that tasted of 30 pieces of silver and the profound failure of your zealotry. The warmth of his skin against yours, the scent of the olive oil and the dust of the road was a final, agonizing reminder of the years of shared intimacy, now corrupted utterly. The kiss was designed to be public, unambiguous, and quick. It was the moment of transfer, the signal that commanded the mob to surge forward. But in that instant of contact, before the guards could even reach the threshold, the master offered his final, gentle words that stopped the entire mechanism of betrayal cold. He didn't scream or curse you. He spoke a single, quiet question, a question of deep, personalized sorrow that cut through the panic and the noise of the approaching mob. His voice, steady and quiet in the cacophony of your heart, shattered the pragmatic shell you had built around your soul. The horror of the kiss was instantly replaced by the crushing shame of his final word, sealing your doom not with condemnation, but with the profound, devastating grief of a final inquiry. This gentle utterance was the ultimate checkmate against your hardened logic, setting the stage for your immediate, panicked collapse. The kiss was the physical act, a quick, cold transaction executed under the harsh, flickering glow of the temple torches. But the master's immediate response was the spiritual execution, the final blow to the fragile architecture of your self-justification. As the warmth of your lips left his cheek, and before the heavy hands of the temple guards could even begin to seize his arms, the master spoke. His voice was not the booming condemnation of a judge or the frantic, desperate cry of a betrayed victim. It was the quiet, steady tone of profound sorrow. a sound that cut through the tension and the clanking iron. And the word he used was the final, crushing blow to your soul. Friend, wherefore art thou come? The raw, devastating suck of this moment lies entirely in that single, agonizing word, friend. The Greek term used here, heteros, is not the intimate philos, the word reserved for deep personal affection or kinship. It was a formal companion, a comrade, a partner, the term acknowledging your shared journey, your place in the mission, and the relationship you had just so decisively discarded. It was a final, crushing reminder of the bond, however strained and political, that you had willingly and cheaply severed. It was a challenge to the role you were playing, rather than an attack on your character. He acknowledged you as a partner in the history they shared, even as you acted as his executioner. He didn't call you betrayer, devil, or thief. He called you friend, and in that single word lay an infinite depth of pity and forgiveness that your practical, calculating mind was utterly unprepared to receive. It shattered the carefully constructed narrative of self-justification you had meticulously built over the preceding days. You had convinced yourself that the master was a failing politician, a misguided fool, or a spiritual fraud, making your betrayal a regrettable necessity, a justifiable means to a political end. But a fraud does not greet his betrayer with the word friend. A fool does not acknowledge the tragic irony of the kiss with such poignant, gentle finality. In that single instant of contact, the entire architecture of your political and financial rationalizations crumbled. The 30 pieces of silver suddenly felt exponentially heavier than 30,000 pounds of lead in your pocket. The zealotry that had driven you to force his hand was revealed as a simple, monstrous error against the face of divine love. Your logical mechanism, the cold instrument that had guided you through the negotiation, the silent march, and the execution of the kiss, ceased to function. You saw not a man being checkmated, but a willing sacrifice. A man whose profound love and acceptance transcended the very violence you had unleashed. The question itself, wherefore art thou come, was not a request for information, but a philosophical inquiry that demanded a reply your soul could not provide. It asked, not for the reason for your presence at that moment, but for the reason for your choice to arrive in this way, leading this mob. It demanded that you acknowledge the moral horror of using a kiss, the ultimate sign of loyalty, to deliver him to the sword. It compelled you, in that fraction of a second, to face the chasm between the ideal of the kingdom you claimed to serve and the monstrous act of desecration you had just completed. There was no defense possible. Every explanation you had manufactured, financial need, political expediency, forcing the master's hand, was instantly revealed as cheap dross compared to the gold of his compassion. The master's gentle question hung in the torchlit air, and it was the final, damning sound you heard clearly before the chaos broke loose. You offered no reply. Your throat was suddenly dry, choked with the realization of cosmic error. There was no argument left, no defense to be made. The weight of his pity was too heavy, the shame of the word friend too profound. Your entire internal system, built on the premise of cold necessity, broke under the pressure of profound, undeserved grace. And then, the moment was violently over. The temple guards, seeing the code of the kiss successfully completed, surged forward, their professional roughness replacing the gentle atmosphere. The master was seized. The sharp voices of the commanders barking orders filled the air, and the loud clanking of metal on metal signaled the end of the peace. Your mission was accomplished. The contract was fulfilled. But instead of the satisfaction of a pragmatic move, you were overcome by pure, blinding panic and the crushing guilt of an irreversible, soul-shattering mistake. There was no time for contemplation, no space for regret, only the instinctive, desperate urge to flee the scene of your disaster. You turned and ran, not waiting to see the master bound, not waiting for the ensuing violence. The gentle word "friend" was the last thing you heard, and it was the only sound that mattered, driving you away from the chaos you had unleashed, leaving you to face the horrifying, immediate consequences of your contract alone. You did not stay. The moment the master was seized by the temple guards, the instant the physical violence of the arrest began, you broke and ran. The word "friend" had not inspired genuine repentance, but pure, instinctual flight. A frantic, desperate need to escape the scene of your crime before the consequences could consume you. The profound suck of this chapter is the shame and paralyzing fear that propelled you away, transforming you from the central actor into a terrified outsider, watching the fulfillment of prophecy and the violent, immediate dissolution of your community unfold like a horrific, sudden storm. You fled into the deeper darkness of the olive groves, tripping over roots and stones, the clatter of the 30 pieces of silver, a shameful, mocking jingle accompanying your panic. Your perspective instantly shifted from the active betrayer to a passive, horrified observer, unable to intervene, yet entirely responsible for the unfolding drama. From your hiding place in the dense shadows, crouching behind an ancient olive tree, you saw the brief, pathetic burst of resistance. It was the loyal, hot-headed Simon Peter, unable to reconcile the peaceful surrender with his revolutionary expectations. He lunged with a sword, attempting to fulfill the zealot fantasy that you yourself had once championed, managing only to cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. This act of violence, the very kind of political resistance you had longed for the master to embrace, was immediately and decisively halted. The master, even in the throes of his arrest, calmly commanded Peter to put away the sword, reaffirming his path of radical peace and nonviolence. This was the final, crushing rejection of the political messiah you had banked your life upon. The king had definitively chosen the path of the servant, and your political chess game had ended in total, humiliating failure. The master, even bound, was still the master, commanding peace and defying the expectations of brute force. You watched as the confusion peaked and the violence escalated. The guards, energized by the small act of resistance, became brutal, asserting their authority with rough hands and harsh shouts. The master was bound, his hands tied, the authority of the state asserting itself over the gentle man of peace. The sight of his unwavering dignity in the face of their rough handling must have been devastating. He did not fight. He did not protest. He merely allowed himself to be taken, fulfilling the destiny you had helped to orchestrate. The focus then shifted to your former companions, the disciples, the Galileans you had lived, traveled, and shared life with for 3 years, panicked and scattered. John fled. Peter followed at a distance, his brief moment of courage dissolving into fear. The others melted into the darkness, abandoning the Master and, crucially, abandoning each other. In a matter of minutes, the community you belonged to, the intense, portable world of the 12, ceased to exist. The bonds of shared mission, forged over years of travel and miracles, snapped under the singular pressure of state power. This was the ultimate, immediate consequence of your contract, the swift and utter loss of your community. You had planned for a new life, a new beginning, armed with the funding from the betrayal. But in that moment, running alone through the shadows, watching your entire social structure disintegrate, you realized the horrific depth of your isolation. You were an outcast, not only from the divine mission, but from the simple, human companionship of the fishermen. They had lost their master. You had lost your world and your identity as a member of the only family you had known for years. There was no victory, no salvage, no political leverage to be found in the sudden, humiliating collapse of the Master's movement. There was only the cold knowledge that you had been the catalyst for the destruction of the only community that had ever truly accepted you, despite your Judean aloofness and your financial anxieties. The disciples were scattering out of fear. You were running out of a guilt far heavier than simple fear, a guilt that now settled upon you with the cold weight of the night air. You stayed hidden until the procession finally disappeared, the flickering torches weaving their way back up the valley toward the city walls and the administrative centers of the Sanhedrin. You were left alone in the quiet, shattered sanctity of the garden, the silence now tainted by the memory of violence and the stench of betrayal. The chaotic excitement was over, replaced by the chilling, undeniable reality of what you had wrought. The night was still young, but the cold, crushing dawn of an irreversible mistake was already beginning to break in your mind, driving you toward a decision of desperate, final consequence that involved the silver that now mocked you. The remainder of the night following the arrest was an unending, cold labyrinth of despair. You did not sleep. There was no corner of Jerusalem dark enough, no shadow deep enough to hide the blazing conviction of your mistake. The suck of this chapter is the physical and mental toll of that first crushing wave of guilt, the agonizing realization that your practical calculation had resulted in a spiritual and human horror. You experienced the deepest, most profound form of disillusionment, not just with the Master's mission, but with your own cold logic. You likely spent the hours hiding, perhaps in an abandoned shed outside the city walls, or huddled in a quiet corner of the olive groves, shivering despite the mild air. You were utterly alone, every sound of the waking city an anxious threat. The clatter of the 30 pieces of silver, which you had secured and hidden, was no longer a sign of successful financial management. It was a rhythmic, tormenting accusation. The weight of those coins, the symbolic price of a slave, was the physical manifestation of your guilt, a weight your pockets could barely bear. Every memory of the preceding 3 years, every gentle parable, every quiet moment of shared teaching now rushed back to you, no longer as political distractions, but as proof of pure, selfless love. The Master's voice, especially the final, devastating question, "Friend, wherefore art thou come?" was an echo that rattled relentlessly in the emptiness of your soul. It mocked the political rationale that had been your shield, the core conflict that drove you, the clash between the political Messiah you desired and the spiritual servant you received, was finally, irrevocably resolved. He had allowed himself to be taken. He had forbidden violence. He had gone like a lamb to the slaughter, confirming beyond all doubt that his kingdom was not of this world and would not be established by the currency of political upheaval or silver. Your cold, rational expectation that he would use the crisis to reveal his power and overturn the state had been completely, humiliatingly wrong. You had not forced a king to arise. You had merely delivered an innocent, prophetic man to his executioners for the lowest possible price. The shame was physical and overwhelming. It manifested as a churning sickness in your gut, a profound, desperate restlessness that forbade rest, and the cold, metallic weight of the silver that had been your salvation and was now your immediate curse. The price, the 30 pieces of silver, now felt exponentially larger than the value of the man it bought. You had sold eternal truth for a few small, tarnished coins, exchanging your place in a divine narrative for a pittance of earthly metal. As the pre-dawn light began to soften the eastern sky, illuminating the familiar outlines of the temple towers, your internal panic cohered into a single, desperate plan. Restitution. The money had to go back. If you could undo the transaction, perhaps you could undo the act. The idea was as foolish as it was desperate, but it was the only rational path left to your now shattered conscience. It was a final attempt to engage the worldly mechanism you understood, commerce and contract, to fix a spiritual crime you could not comprehend. You walked back toward the temple area, not with the calculating stealth of an informer, but with the frantic public desperation of a condemned man. The sight of the city stirring, the normal routines of the early morning beginning, contrasted violently with the internal storm raging within you. You sought out the chief priests and the elders, the cynical, powerful men who had sealed your contract, and burst into their presence, likely in the chaos of their early morning session. "I have sinned," you cried out, your voice likely hoarse and trembling, your words tumbling out in a frantic flood. "I have betrayed innocent blood." This was not merely confession. It was a desperate, final plea for them to acknowledge the error, to admit that the transaction was flawed, and to release the master. You were asking them to participate in your repentance, to undo the political act that had brought you such spiritual ruin. You threw the coins down on the temple floor, rejecting the physical embodiment of your betrayal. But the priests were cold, professional, and utterly detached. They saw your sudden, desperate repentance as an unfortunate inconvenience, not a spiritual crisis. Their response was the final, definitive rejection that slammed the door on any hope of absolution. "What is that to us? See thou to that." Your guilt was entirely your own problem. Their contract was fulfilled, the money was tainted, and your soul was entirely your own concern. This indifference was the final, isolating blow, confirming that your salvation was entirely external to their earthly concerns. You were left utterly alone with your guilt and the cursed silver, propelling you toward the final, desperate act of a man beyond hope. Having traded the community of love for the cold, transactional indifference of the religious elite, you stood before the chief priests and the elders, the morning light, cold, hard, and revealing, shining down upon the polished stone of the temple chambers. This was the Sanhedrin, the highest religious and judicial authority in Israel, and these men were the pragmatic power brokers of Jerusalem, the very clients who had guaranteed your security. But in this moment of your desperate, public repentance, their faces were masks of professional disdain and icy rejection. This was the moment where the full, crushing suck of your mistake became apparent. The humiliation of being utterly rejected by the very clients who had employed you, who now refused to take responsibility for the price of blood. They treated you not as a useful, if regrettable tool, but as a tainted object, a piece of trash to be immediately discarded, setting you apart from all society. You had stumbled into their session, a chaotic, early morning assembly aimed at confirming the verdict against the master and delivering him to the Romans for final execution. They were focused on the high politics of state control and religious supremacy, and your hysterical confession was nothing more than a noisy, embarrassing interruption. Your voice was raw, echoing in the stone halls as you screamed the truth. I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood. But to them, these words were merely the inevitable, messy residue of a completed transaction. They had bought information, and now the informant was suffering the predictable moral breakdown. It was unprofessional, sentimental, and ultimately irrelevant to their purpose. They looked at you with eyes that held centuries of condescension. To them, you were a zealot agitator, a disruptive follower of a false prophet, and now a cheap turncoat. You were Judean, yes, but you had associated with Galilean rustics, and you had contaminated yourself by becoming a party to a capital arrest. They saw your silver not as their own payment, but as your price, your guilt, and your damnation. Their response, the final, cruelest refusal, was delivered with cold, surgical precision. What is that to us? See that thou to that. This statement was far more than an ethical disclaimer. It was a total and absolute excommunication. They were essentially telling you that the spiritual burden of the master's fate and the physical taint of the blood money was yours and yours alone. They were absolving themselves of any shared liability, pushing you back into the void you had tried to escape. They refused to even touch your burden. You were attempting to participate in a ritual of repentance, a process of atonement familiar to any Jew: confession, restitution, and sacrifice. But the priests refused to validate the transaction. They wouldn't take the coins back, because to accept the refund would be to admit that the money was indeed the price of blood, and that their contract had been one of murder, not merely political detainment. By refusing the silver, they forced the entire unbearable weight of the betrayal back onto your shoulders. The master's purity had now been contrasted with the priest's cynicism, leaving you nowhere to turn. You stood there, breathing heavily, the weight of the silver suddenly unbearable. The coins, cold, hard, and still in your hand, were no longer a potential investment or a security fund. They were instruments of death, actively setting you apart from the community. You had gone to the religious center of your world seeking absolution, or at least shared guilt, and instead, you were cast out with the full force of its institutional rejection. The temple, the literal heart of the covenant, had judged you and found you tainted beyond redemption. The Master, in his gentle pity, had called you friend. The priests, your worldly clients, had dismissed you as nothing. In that moment, you realized the profound difference between the community you had betrayed and the authority you had sought to join. The refusal of the chief priests was the final, irreversible spiritual shock. Their icy detachment, their casual dismissal of your desperate, tearful confession. What is that to us? See thou to that! Left you standing alone, holding the physical evidence of your damning mistake, with nowhere left to turn and no one willing to share the crushing burden of your guilt. The only recourse left was a violent, public act of self-condemnation. This chapter focuses on the dramatic, furious act of casting the coins onto the sacred temple floor. It was a desperate, performative repentance, emphasizing the physical weight and sound of the silver as it clattered, the deafening noise of your own ruined soul. The transition from pathetic pleading to explosive rage was instantaneous. If they would not take the money back, if they would not participate in the undoing of the contract, then you would force the rejection upon them. You would make the very walls of the temple bear witness to the wickedness of the bargain, forcing the priests to confront the tangible residue of the blood they had paid for. You raised your hand, holding the leather pouch of coins, the sack that had represented your security, your worldly wisdom, and your final, fatal error. The weight of the 30 pieces of silver was immense. Not merely the mass of the metal itself, but the accumulated moral tonnage of the crime. You hurled the pouch down, the sudden, sharp, angry motion fueled by panic and self-loathing. The leather burst open or was flung wide, and the coins scattered across the stone floor of the treasury chamber, or wherever the priests held their early morning council. The sound was shattering. The clatter of the silver was not a quiet tinkle, but a loud, metallic drum roll that echoed off the high walls, a sound unique in that sacred space, a profane noise of commerce and death disrupting the stillness of prayer. Each coin that spun and settled on the floor was a tiny, mocking reminder of the price of the Master's life. 30 distinct, unforgivable clangs that reverberated in your ears, a sound that would forever be the soundtrack of your downfall. You watched the coins spin, reflecting the torchlight or the pale morning sun, glittering like worthless tears. It was an act of total, final rejection. You were physically divorcing yourself from the prophet, trying desperately to leave the taint on the ground, hoping that by shedding the coins, you could shed the guilt. But the realization immediately crashed down. The guilt was not in the silver. The guilt was in you. The coins were merely a symbol, a catalyst. Throwing them down was a pointless gesture, a dramatic tantrum that achieved nothing except confirming your insanity in the eyes of the priests. The priests reacted with characteristic professionalism and distaste. They would not step forward to gather the money themselves, lest they touch the polluted coins. Instead, they recoiled, signaling to servants or lower-ranking Levites to deal with the mess. Their faces were a study in revulsion. Not revulsion at the betrayal, but revulsion at the public scene and the handling of the tainted gold. They saw the money, but they did not see your soul-shattering repentance. They saw only the legal problem. Money that could not be put back into the temple treasury because it was the price of a life. Your attempt to undo the act had failed entirely. The money was now abandoned, the contract still fully enforced, and the master still in chains, moving inexorably toward his death. You had forfeited your profit and your soul in the same transaction, and now you were left with nothing but the silence that followed the clatter. There was no reprieve, no shared blame, and no way back. The dramatic performance of throwing down the guilt had only solidified your isolation, leaving you utterly alone, judged by the cold stone of the temple and the colder eyes of the men who ruled it. The city now beckoned as a vast, indifferent tomb, and you were a ghost within it. The act of casting down the silver marked the final, shattering separation. You stumbled away from the temple courts, leaving the coins and the indifferent priests behind, realizing with chilling finality that you were now a ghost in the world you had once inhabited. The central theme of this chapter is the absolute, suffocating isolation of the condemned. You were now hated by your former master's followers, scorned as a turncoat by the very clients who had employed you, and left utterly alone in Jerusalem, a man with no loyalty, no community, and nowhere left to turn. The entire city, once a center of pilgrimage and promise, became a vast, echoing prison of your own making. You wandered aimlessly through the city streets, the sun climbing higher, casting sharp, merciless shadows. Every person you saw was a potential accuser. If they knew the master, they knew you as his treasurer and now as his betrayer. If they were temple loyalists, they saw you as the filthy instrument used to perform a necessary but vile task. You were tainted goods, rejected by both the sacred and the profane. The communal identity you had maintained for 3 years, that sense of belonging to a purposeful collective, was ripped away, leaving a gaping, burning void. The isolation was not just social, it was existential. Your mind, once sharp and calculating, was now a fractured landscape of regret and panic. You could no longer hide behind the rationale of political expediency. The only truth left was the memory of the master's face and the devastating pity in his final word, friend. That single word had become the barbed wire that separated you from peace. You were unable to forgive yourself for the magnitude of the error, and you had forfeited your right to seek forgiveness from him. There was no one to turn to. You couldn't seek out Peter or John. They would see the blood on your hands. You couldn't return to the priests. They had already told you to see to your own fate. You were adrift in a city of thousands, yet every face was a wall, every alley a dead end. The crowds preparing for the Passover felt like a deafening wave of humanity that simply passed through you, acknowledging your existence only as an obstacle. You were invisible and yet marked, anonymous and yet known. The crushing suck of this state was the self-inflicted judgment. You had made your contract with the expectation of a political uprising or a divine intervention, that would validate your pragmatic choice. Now, facing the cold, irreversible reality of the arrest and the priest's cynicism, you realized you had been utterly played, both by the system and by your own blinding greed and impatience. You had engineered the sacrifice of the only man who had ever offered true, unconditional inclusion. As the hours dragged on, and the news of the mock trial and the subsequent Roman involvement must have begun to filter through the city's whispers, the reality of the master's fate became inescapable. It would not be a long political imprisonment, it would be execution. The finality of the situation, the knowledge that the master would die because of your kiss, your silver, and your direction, was the final breaking point. There was no escape in flight because your guilt was internal. The city had become a mausoleum for your hope, and your conscience the sharpest, most relentless guard. Driven to the edge of sanity by the silence of his former companions and the active scorn of his employers, you were left with only one final, desperate option: to silence the unrelenting noise of your shame and end the agonizing, insufferable isolation. The noise of the city, once a comforting bustle, had become an unbearable, chaotic roar of accusation. The crushing weight of your isolation, solidified by the rejection of the priests, left you with a singular, final conclusion. There was no possible pathway back to life. Having abandoned your community, defied your teacher, and been scorned by your clients, you existed in a moral void that could not be endured. This chapter focuses on the slow, heavy, and inexorable walk toward the field where you would end your own life, accepting the ultimate self-inflicted judgment. The final path began somewhere outside the city walls, away from the crowds and the judgmental eyes of Jerusalem. You moved with a heavy, purposeful gait, the lightness of your earlier, panicked flight replaced by the terrible, resolute commitment of despair. The suck of this moment was the total loss of hope and the self-inflicted judgment, the realization that you had traded eternal, unimaginable glory for a handful of tarnished silver and now had neither. Your mind was no longer capable of the intricate political calculations that had once defined you. It was filled only with stark, singular images: the master's pity-filled eyes, the flash of Peter's sword, and the master's immediate command to sheathe it, the clatter of the silver on the stone. All your ambition, all your zealotry, all your desire for a strong, conquering Messiah had led you only to this final, lonely walk towards a desolate patch of ground. The field you chose, whether known to you beforehand or merely the first suitable, lonely place, was likely remote, dusty, and silent. It was a space defined by indifference, a landscape that perfectly matched the emptiness of your soul. As you arrived, the reality of the final act must have pressed in upon you. This was not a symbolic gesture, nor was it a political maneuver. This was the termination of your entire existence, an acknowledgement that the damage you had done to your own spirit was beyond repair. You had sought to force the master into action, to compel him toward the path of conquest. But in the end, you were the one compelled by your own guilt, your own failure, and the cosmic horror of having kissed the divine. Your life was now defined entirely by that act of betrayal, and in your mind, The only way to silence the echo of the silver and the word friend was to stop the heart that heard them. The final moments were a stark contrast to the dramatic chaos of the preceding hours. There were no witnesses, no guards, no crowds, only you, the ancient trees, and the silent, indifferent sky. It was a private, desolate ending to a very public, political failure. The finality of the decision was complete, a definitive act of self-condemnation that no earthly or spiritual authority had commanded. Only your own unbearable shame. As your life ended, the narrative of the tainted money continued without you. The priests, those cold pragmatists you had sought to impress, gathered up the silver you had thrown down. They debated the legal conundrum. They could not put the price of blood into the temple treasury. They decided instead to use the money to purchase the very field you had died in, known forever after as the field of blood, a potter's field meant for the burial of foreigners and the poor. Even in death, your betrayal served a final, ironic purpose, creating a perpetual monument to your crime, marking a piece of ground with the physical symbol of the sin you had desperately tried to abandon. You were gone, but the cursed money, the tangible evidence of your suck, remained in the world, forever defining the price and the place of your tragic failure. The noise of the temple had subsided, replaced by the grim silence of the priests counting the cost. You were gone, vanished into the abyss of your own making. But the 30 pieces of silver, the physical evidence of your failed contract, remained scattered on the sacred floor. This chapter details the fate of that money, the purchase of the potter's field, Axeldama, forever known as the field of blood. The profound, cold suck of this outcome is the cruel, biting irony. Your betrayal money, meant for political gain and financial security, was used to buy a cemetery, forever marking a place of death and foreign burial, a permanent, mocking monument to your act. The priests, those pragmatic, legalistic men, were immediately faced with a conundrum. The coins were now Corban, consecrated money, but they were simultaneously polluted, the price of blood. Under Jewish law, money paid for a capital crime could not be returned to the general treasury. It was defiled, tainted by the sin it represented. Their discussion must have been a cynical, clinical exercise in legal maneuvering, utterly devoid of any reference to the innocent man they had condemned, or the desperate soul who had just fled their presence. The life of the master and the fate of Judas were irrelevant. Only the legal status of the metal mattered. They decided, in their chilling, institutional wisdom, to dedicate the money to a public, charitable use that did not violate the sanctity of the temple treasury. Their solution was to purchase the potter's field, a small, desolate patch of clay ground located outside the walls of Jerusalem, a place utterly unfit for noble burial. This piece of property, useless for agriculture or building, was suddenly designated as a burial ground for strangers, for foreigners who died in Jerusalem and had no family plot. The ultimate symbol of the outcast, the alien, the spiritually unattached. This purchase was the final, devastating insult to your memory, Judas. It cemented your shame into the geography of Jerusalem. The field, now named Akeldama, the field of blood, was not your grave, but it was your monument. The money you had earned was transformed into a perpetual physical legacy of your moral failure. You had intended the silver to be a means of future political action, a source of personal security, or perhaps a tool for forcing a national revolution. Instead, it became a piece of land reserved for the anonymous dead, for those who died isolated and friendless, a silent, perpetually echoing testimony to the man who betrayed his Lord. The irony was relentless and cruel. You had rejected your community and your master, seeking alliance with the powerful chief priests. Yet, those same priests used your stained wages to provide a final resting place for the ultimate outsiders, the very people you had inadvertently become. Your desire for control and wealth resulted in the creation of a cemetery for the forgotten, funded entirely by your cosmic mistake. The ground itself became cursed, a place nobody of status would dare approach without profound reverence or superstitious fear. The field of blood, a patch of barren earth purchased for a pittance, now carried a weight of theological and historical significance far exceeding its value. It was the physical endpoint of the chain of betrayal, the kiss, the payment, the death, the land. Every traveler, every pilgrim who passed by that desolate plot would be reminded for generations to come that a man had sold the divine for silver, and that the silver, being too polluted even for the temple, could only buy a final resting place for the unloved dead. The field of blood was the true, cold inheritance of your transaction, and it was a legacy that mocked your every ambitious thought and every pragmatic calculation. You were gone, but the cursed land, purchased by your guilt, remained, defining the price and the place of your tragic failure with chilling permanence. The finality of the field of blood, the cursed purchase of the priests, set the stage for your own ignominious end. The narrative of your death, as recorded by the scribes who sought to make sense of your chaotic final moments, is a study in symbolic horror, contrasting two accounts that both converge on the same terrible, brutal truth. The focus here is not on the graphic details themselves, but on the crushing spiritual suck of your demise, the ignominious, unceremonious, and violent manner of your death, ensuring you receive no dignity in life or death, cementing your status as one irrevocably outside of God's grace and human pity. The two stories of your end, one emphasizing the hanging out of self-condemnation, the other describing the sudden, violent rupture and the scattering of your internal organs. Both serve the same damning theological purpose. They ensure that Judas Iscariot receives no peace, no traditional burial rites, and no quiet rest, but rather a spectacular, gruesome, and publicly horrific conclusion to a life of secret scheming. In the first account, you chose the rope. Driven by the paralyzing shame that had been rejected by the priests and amplified by the master's arrest, you sought out a final, quiet place, perhaps near the very field your money had just purchased. A final, solitary judgment against yourself. The rope was the ancient symbol of absolute despair and self-revulsion, the ultimate rejection of the gift of life. This act itself was a final, desperate refusal to accept the possibility of forgiveness. You had seen the master's boundless pity, yet you judged your own crime to be too great, too profound, too fundamentally damaging to the cosmic order to be redeemed. The failure was not in the crime itself, but in your complete lack of hope, The second account, perhaps describing the result of the first, or a separate tradition altogether, is even more violent in its implication of divine judgment. It speaks of you bursting asunder, falling headlong, and having your bowels gush out. Regardless of the physical reality, whether the hanging failed and you fell onto sharp rocks, or whether the sheer physical force of internal shame caused a rupture, the symbolic horror is devastating. This was not a death of quiet resignation, but a violent, visceral undoing. It was a death designed to horrify, to signify a soul so utterly consumed by its own moral corruption that its very physical form could not contain the internal devastation. It was the ultimate, horrifying punctuation mark on your career as the betrayer. The suck of this fate is the complete lack of ceremony. You died alone, without a witness, and without a hand to offer comfort or cover your nakedness. There was no one to mourn you, no one to offer the traditional blessings, and no one to ensure a respectful burial. You were the treasurer, the pragmatic man, the intellectual of the group, and yet you died like a dog in the wilderness, your body left, exposed and subject to the elements. This violent, ignominious end served to fulfill your legacy as the ultimate outsider. You had become the man who stepped outside the circle of grace, and your end was crafted to reflect that cosmic banishment. Your body was not laid to rest in a familial tomb. Your physical remnants were left in an unmarked, desolate place, likely discovered later by the very servants who had followed you with torches to Gethsemane. Your life of betrayal was sealed by a death that was grotesque and final, ensuring that the last image of Judas Iscariot was not that of a grieving penitent, but of a man consumed by his own overwhelming, unrecoverable mistake, forever cementing his status as one irrevocably outside of God's grace and human pity. Your death was immediate, violent, and unceremonious, a private moment of self-condemnation that was swiftly overshadowed by the cosmic events unfolding in Jerusalem, the Master's trial, crucifixion, and the subsequent impossible resurrection. But even as the narrative of redemption began for your former companions, your legacy was being shaped and sealed in the coldest terms imaginable. This chapter addresses the immediate reaction of the remaining disciples and the selection of Matthias to replace you. The crushing suck is the deliberate, organized erasure of your name from the sacred list of the 12, while simultaneously guaranteeing that your name would be remembered only as the definition of betrayal for 2 millennia. You were reduced to a necessary villain, never a man. The remaining 11 disciples, having endured the fear, the shame, and the triumph of the resurrection and ascension, now face the daunting task of reconstituting their sacred number. They stood as the core foundation of a new Giyusam global movement, and the gap you left, the missing 12th pillar, was a spiritual and structural flaw that needed immediate rectification. They could not begin the mission with the stain of a betrayer's absence. The disciple Peter, the rock who had himself failed and been restored, took the lead. He stood before the nascent community of believers and addressed the vacancy created by your demise. The language used in that moment of reckoning was utterly clinical, focusing not on the tragedy of your soul, but on the legal and theological necessity of your replacement. They spoke of you as a man who had obtained part of this ministry, but who had subsequently turned aside, and whose place had been vacated, requiring another to take his bishopric. The suck of this erasure was absolute. You were not remembered as Judas, who made a terrible mistake, or Judas, who suffered unbearable guilt. You were simply Judas, who became a guide to those who arrested Jesus, the one whose act fulfilled the scripture of betrayal. Your name was immediately and deliberately struck from the roll, a single black mark against the purity of the apostleship. Matthias was chosen to take the place in this ministry and apostleship from which Judas turned aside to go to his own place. That phrase, to go to his own place, was a polite biblical euphemism for your damnation. A final, cold acknowledgement that you had chosen a path entirely separate from the kingdom. The irony is that this very act of erasure ensured your eternal memory. By being the one who was removed, you became the necessary villain, the dark foil against which the loyalty of the others would forever shine. You were no longer a complex, conflicted man of zealotry and finance. You were reduced to a theological symbol, the archetype of the lost soul. Your name, Iscariot, became synonymous with treachery, a word used globally to denote the lowest form of moral failure. Your life, in the grand narrative of history, became purely functional. You were the catalyst, the necessary step that propelled the Master to the cross, thereby enabling the redemption of the entire world. Your singular, monstrous act ensured the salvation of billions, yet you yourself were deemed unsalvageable, the lone exception to the very grace your actions made possible. You became the required mechanism of the prophecy, the tool that had to be picked up and discarded. The disciples completed their task efficiently. The number was restored, the foundation secured, and the stain removed. Your replacement, Matthias, received the divine blessing, and the mission moved forward with relentless speed, leaving your complicated, miserable human struggle entirely behind. You were not mourned. You were replaced. You were not understood. You were categorized. You were not saved. You were used. This was the final, devastating injustice. You traded your fleeting life for a name that would echo through history, not as a man who lived and failed, but as the eternal, necessary definition of betrayal. Forever a tool and a warning, never a soul saved. Your tragic story ties back to the profound existential suck of your eternal legacy. Judas Iscariot's narrative is the ultimate story of unrecoverable failure, a lifetime of agonizing regret that continues to echo through 2 millennia of human history. You are gone, your body resting in an ignominious field, your name erased from the sacred records, yet your essence remains central to the drama of faith, a necessary dark shadow against the brilliance of grace. The suck of your eternal legacy is knowing that you are the man everyone loves to hate, the figure around whom endless theological debates swirl. Was Judas free in his choice, or was he merely a pawn of destiny, a tragic actor compelled to fulfill an ancient prophecy? The scriptures state that you fulfilled what was written, yet you were held accountable for your own place. This endless, agonizing paradox, the tension between free will and divine necessity, is your perpetual, lonely burden. You are trapped forever in the question, did you betray Christ willingly, or were you merely fulfilling the will of a God who needed a villain? Every sermon preached on your name, every play staged about the passion, reduces your complex, conflicted soul, your ambition, your zealotry, your financial anxieties, your disillusionment, into a single, flat, damning noun, the betrayer. You are not allowed the complexity of Peter, who denied the Master 3 times and was restored. You are denied the simplicity of the other disciples, who merely fled. Your failure was active, monetary, and absolute, ensuring that your memory remains singularly unforgivable in the popular imagination. Your story is the ultimate caution against the sin of despair. Peter's denial, though equally devastating, was followed by weeping, repentance, and, most crucially, hope. Your betrayal was followed by self-condemnation, an inability to believe that the Master's grace, which he had offered to you in the form of the sop and the word friend, could possibly extend to your specific crime. You judged yourself too harshly, rejecting the very mercy your Master was dying to extend. That failure of hope is the final, most complete suck of your existence. You are eternally fixed as the man who was offered the greatest prize in history, a front row seat to the divine, and traded it for the cheapest commodity. You stand forever as the warning sign on the path of expediency, a constant reminder that cold, material logic is incapable of processing spiritual truth. Your pragmatism led you to a field of clay. Your companion's faith led them to the ends of the earth. The entire world was redeemed by the transaction you facilitated, yet you remain outside of the redemption, the price paid for your services being the only part of the exchange that was deemed tainted. You are the ultimate paradox of salvation, a necessary instrument of divine love, yet a soul condemned by his own inability to accept that love. And so you rest in the field of blood, a patch of ground purchased with your eternal shame. Your sleep is lonely, marked by the echoes of that silver and the chilling question of the Master. You are Judas Iscariot, the man who was a tool, a warning, and a tragic, broken human being, condemned to an eternal legacy where your name means only one thing: the high cost of selling your soul for 30 pieces of silver. Your tragic narrative is complete, leaving behind only the profound silence of a life that chose despair over hope.